Hi there, welcome to our Sunday School lesson for July 5th, our first at home Sunday School series using our Gospel Project material. We're working our way through the New Testament now and the teachings of Jesus. This week we're looking at Jesus teaching about discipleship. As a matter of fact, that is the title. Jesus teaches about discipleship. And it comes from essentially the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew's Gospel, roughly chapters 5, 6, and 7. And the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most important texts in the history of mankind. It's one of the most important in the Bible, and that makes it one of the most important in the history of the world. It is where Jesus personally, as God, speaking for God and as God, explains the law to the people and explains what the law was supposed to do and explains where they're getting the law wrong and how they're getting off on it. And essentially, he takes the law, which has mainly just teeth, its rules and consequences, and he takes something that's big and scary, and he simultaneously turns it into something impossibly more scary, yet at the same time something smooth and gentle. He takes the rough edges of the law and rounds them off in an incredibly beautiful way, as he talks about essentially what the law was supposed to do was to help you understand and get to the heart of the matter. When I say don't hate, or when the law says don't hate, it means that you need to check your heart and see, or excuse me, when it says don't murder, you need to check your heart and look for hatred, because hatred breeds murder. It also breeds a lot of things that aren't quite murder, but at the very least of it, the simple hard angle of it is murder. And we were supposed to, as a people, as God's people, work our way backwards into that, and we just never could. Hence the need for Jesus Christ and the need for the Sermon on the Mount to explain to us. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery with a woman, but I say don't even look at a woman with lust. If you have, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And so Jesus is explaining to us that the law was easy on us, so to speak. But as a matter of fact, we don't need all of the laws in order to obey God even better, I will say, than the law requires, because most of these things we know are heart issues. Now, I'm not saying that we can obey God perfectly without any knowledge at all of His Word or of the law. That's not what I'm saying, but I am saying that we have this law written on our hearts that is more precise even than the law written in the Bible. You know when you're doing something wrong. You know, like sometimes I'll look at my kids and I say, now you knew that wasn't right, didn't you? Now you know that I said don't do X, Y, and Z, but you thought you'd do, this thing out here, this, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, this thing, it's not quite in the ABCs, the things that I told you not to do, but you're not obeying the spirit of what I said. And that's what Jesus is getting down to. The Jews were experts at obeying the law, the letter of the law, and yet ignoring the spirit of the law. And they failed to understand what God was teaching them through the law, which is the law was to be a tutor to teach them to guard their hearts. It was to teach them to look inside, to teach them, the things that are right and wrong in general. That, again, the way we teach our children. We don't start off teaching our children why. We start off teaching them the law, right? You don't say, now, if you want to touch the stove, that's fine, but understand that when you press your flesh against that iron skillet has been sitting above a flame that is burning at, 1,500 degrees, and that 1,500 degrees is being dispersed throughout the iron, and that part of the iron right there, I'm guessing, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 to 400 degrees. So when you press your flesh against it, your flesh is going to singe and burn, and that will send signals to your nerve endings in your finger right there, which will transmit signals up your arm into your brain, letting you know that you've been injured, and it will be translated to your brain as pain. So just letting you know that, No, we say to them, don't touch the stove. Don't touch the stove. And we don't tell them, why. We don't explain to them that there's a pot up there. One of them is cold because it's not been turned on yet. One of them's hot. We just say, don't touch the stove. And the law was kind of like that for human beings. It was a don't touch the stove sort of a moment. And we were supposed to figure out that, hey, the reason I don't touch the stove is because I don't know the difference between a hot pot and a cold pot as a child. So it's just better for me to just stand back and just recognize that whole area up there is hot. I shouldn't go near it. Instead, what we did was we said, okay, don't touch the stove. Well, the little buttons on the top of it aren't actually the stove. That's the buttons of the stove, so I can touch those. And the cabinet right next to it, I can touch that, and I can get right up to the stove, and I can take a stick, and I can touch the stove with a stick because I'm not touching it. And so we've got all of these laws built in, to tell us, and that's what the Jews were doing here. They were figuring out how to touch the stove without actually disobeying the law, instead of recognizing that, hey, if you touch the stove, it'll burn you. And so that's kind of what Jesus is doing here. He's telling you, hey, just don't touch hot things. Don't get burned. But the people didn't want to hear that. They wanted to know how long of a stick they could use to touch the stove. And so here we go, the Sermon on the Mount. We're looking at 3 points. Jesus' disciples are to be salt and light from Matthew 5:13 through 16. His disciples are to obey for God's glory, not their own, Matthew 6:1 through 4. And Jesus' disciples are to live purposefully, Matthew 7:19 through 24. All right, point number 1, Jesus' disciples are to be salt and light. And we'll read that from the scriptures, Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. We may be camped out here for a little while. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking we might not even get out of point number 1, but that'll be all right. So, point number 1, Jesus' disciples are to be salt and light. Let's read the scriptures. You are the salt of the earth. Kind of a good way to start. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So, this is one of my favorite little passages of Scripture, if you will, one of my favorite little illustrations of Jesus. Salt of the earth and light of the world are kind of, those phrases have made their way into our vocabulary, if you will. And as a matter of fact, there are dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds, I don't know, of words and phrases and figures of speech that have made their way into the English language from the scriptures, from the Bible alone, most of them from the King James Bible. But this is 2 of the good ones, right? Salt of the earth, that means just a good old person. And light of the world, obviously, has its own connotations there. But Jesus is using the time-tested ancient Near Eastern and Jewish tradition of a chiasm. It's a literary structure where we take 2 things, and a chiasm is based on the Greek letter chi, which is essentially looks exactly like the English letter X, so like this. And it's called a chiasm because it ties together 2 thoughts, And typically speaking, it compares and contrasts them so that the first half of one thing compares to the second half of another thing, and vice versa, so that the two things tend to compare like this. Anyway, it's not an English class. I'd never claimed to be an English professor, but anyway, he's comparing these two ideas, and typically in a chiasm, either the differences or the similarities are what makes it make sense. And in this case, there are a lot of similarities. So I would think that salt and light, the similarities between the two, is where we're going to find the meaning or the punch of this illustration. What does it mean for us? And I would say we don't even understand what this passage means for us. What is Jesus even saying? We don't really know unless we understand the illustration, unless you understand what it means to be salt and light, or what salt and light mean to people. So let's first of all talk about salt and light in a really, really basic sense. So 500 years ago, salt and light are not easy to come by. They're not in abundance. Salt has to be mined. It has to be gathered. It has to be consumed on purpose. We have so much sodium in our diet from processed foods that we're not in danger of not getting enough salt or sodium intake. But that was a danger in the ancient world. People had to intentionally, purposefully ingest salt. The Roman soldiers were supplied with a supply of salt on the battlefields as they marched, because they couldn't go and find their own salt. And so that was one of the things that the Roman government would supply to its soldiers, was its salt, and hence the phrase, somebody who's not worth their salt. They would have a salt ration. And if you had a guy who was a really poor soldier, well, he wasn't even worth the salt they were giving him. So salt was an incredibly important commodity. Light, just as much. We walk into a room and flip on the light. And you know what? Even if you don't flip on the light, you've got little lights like this one here on my microphone that are glowing all over your room probably. They're probably on the back of your cell phone, your computer, your TV, your microwave, your stove, your alarm clock. I mean, you probably have 25 or 30 of these little lights in your house right now glowing. And if they all go out, your neighbor's lights are all lit up and it's coming in your windows. I heard a story from a missionary in Haiti who was telling me one day about, the darkness in Haiti, and he was comparing it, the spiritual darkness to the actual physical darkness. And, Haiti has an incredibly erratic, unreliable power grid, so much so that most businesses that are there, most homes, simply do not rely on the national power grid. If they want power, they have generators and battery backups and that sort of thing. But most people just don't have power at all, because there's no point in it when you might get power an hour a day or 2 hours a day, or it might go off at any point when it does come on. So they just don't even worry about having electricity. But the missionary I was talking to, he has a generator out back. And at this point in time, they didn't have battery backups. The house ran off the generator. And they have a big compound with a wall all the way around it. I think it's all the way around. Maybe at this time it wasn't. But the point is, he was walking in his backyard when suddenly the generator kicked off. And he was walking out from his backyard to check the generator. Ironically, I think he was checking the generator. Anyway, and the generator kicks off as he's walking through his backyard. Now, again, he has a backyard that's probably 2.5 or 3 acres. It's a big piece of land. And there's trees and there's just stuff all in it. It's not like a lawn. There's buildings and all paths and rocks and hills and everything. And so he says, I made the mistake. When the power went off, I made the mistake of spinning around and trying to look back at the house just to see the house, just like you would if the lights go off and you look up at the light, or whatever the case is. the power went off, the generator cuts off, and the lights go off, and he spins around to look at the house. He said, I made a mistake because I disoriented myself and I couldn't figure out which way I was facing. And he said, Woody, you have no idea how dark it is until you're in an entire country that has no electricity. There's not a street light on. There's not a cell phone light on. There's not a light in somebody's house. There's not campfires burning everywhere because it's basically jungle. And you couldn't see if somebody had a campfire burning 20 yards from you. And there's no lights in anybody's home. There's no emergency lights. There's no automobiles riding around with lights on. It's pitch black. He said it was so black, I couldn't even see the hand in front of my face. It was a cloudy night and there was no moon. I couldn't even see the stars. I couldn't see the hand in front of my face. And he said, I would have given $100 for a flashlight right then. And he said, I learned my lesson. He said, I usually kept a flashlight on, but then he said, I'd never go out of my house without a flashlight in my pocket, even if it's in the middle of the day, because who knows where I might be come nightfall. And the most important thing to me is light. You can't see your path for your feet without light. That's what he said. I couldn't even see where I was walking. I couldn't tell if I was about to walk into a tree. And he said he spent hours. I think he said he spent 2 hours in his backyard trying to find where he was going because he couldn't walk in a straight line. He'd walk into a tree and he'd have to go around it, and he'd hit a rock and he'd have to step over it, and he'd end up going like this and like this. And he said eventually, I think I would find a wall and be able to follow it, but he didn't know which wall he was finding. You just find a flat wall and you think the house is that way. Well, I'm on this side of the lawn, so the house is actually that way. And he said, Woody, it took me 2 hours to find my house. And then get inside, grope in the darkness, find a drawer, get a flashlight, and then start lighting candles. And he said it was brutal. So, this is something that's going on right now. You can imagine 2,000 years ago when Jesus spoke, candles are incredibly expensive. Lamp oil is incredibly expensive. Rich people like candles and lamps. Most people, just when it goes dark, they just go to sleep. They go to bed. Salt is incredibly expensive and hard to come by because not only do you need it to eat, but in this day and time, you need it to preserve food. Without salt, you cannot eat meat. You can't eat, or without it, it would be hard. You'd have to eat meat fresh, or you'd have to smoke it, so it was used to preserve things. It was used in this case to provide taste, I think. But what we don't understand is how incredibly foundational these sorts of things were to us. To us, we might say, you're like gasoline and electricity. I know that sounds kind of lowbrow for the scriptures, but you're like gasoline and electricity for the world. I mean, that for us, that's what our world revolves around. Imagine if you woke up tomorrow and you had no access to electricity or gasoline, how difficult your life would be. And that's kind of the way it is here. You have no salt, you have no light. But the salt and the light are incredibly essential commodities. And they're commodities that you can't just work for yourself and get. You have to get light by a lamp, oil. You have to get salt by mining it, buying it. So it's difficult to come by, but it's incredibly important. What does salt give to you? What is the basic benefit of salt? Well, it's taste. I believe this is salt. Salt loses its saltiness. That's what he says. It loses its saltiness. Well, saltiness to me is about taste. I know a lot of people think it's mostly preservation, but I think in this case, we're talking mostly about the taste of things, in my opinion. And what does light do for you? It allows you to see. Salt allows you to taste. Light allows you to see. Think about the difference between those two. Remember how I said when we compare these things, we'll find the meaning in the comparison and in the contrast, in the things that are the same and the things that are different. They're the same in that they're incredibly important commodities to an ancient Near Eastern culture. Way more important than you and I can imagine, as if it was gasoline and electricity or something like that. So, how are they different? Well, this is interesting. You cannot experience salt from a distance. Nor can I demonstrate my saltiness. That sounds bad in today's vernacular. For those of you older people, salty means, for today's youth, it means something like cranky or ornery. So we're not saying orneriness. We're talking about scriptural saltiness. You can't experience saltiness from a distance. You have to get very intimate with something, literally put it in your mouth, to experience saltiness. It is one-to-one. It is personal. It is direct contact. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here. You're the salt of the earth. You are going out to people individually, one by one by one. You're going to that neighbor, not to your neighbors, to that one neighbor. You're walking across the street. You're saying hello. You're asking how your mom's doing. You're saying, hey, can I help you this weekend? Get your trash up to the road because I know you're going out of town. You're being salt to that person directly. You're affecting them directly, one to one. You're getting up close and personal in a way that you can only experience salt that way. You can't experience salt as a group. I can't stand in front of a group of people and give saltiness. Okay? But light is the opposite. Light is experienced as a group. Light is something I do for a group of people. It's something I do for the public. It affects many people at one time. It's not up close and personal. You don't get right into somebody's eye and shine a flashlight. That isn't helpful for them. You shine a light and they get to see the whole picture. That's what light is for. Light is what you do in the big picture. It's what you do in the public sphere. So salt is how you affect people one-on-one. Light is how you affect your community, your street, your church, your city, your little league team, your dance team, your school, your workplace. That's what light is. Not only that, but if you think about it, so again, those are the differences, how they're different. Again, how are they the same? Well, they are, interestingly, both pictured here in a way that can lose them. Now, there's been a debate for years about what Jesus meant when he said lose its saltiness. Because we know that salt pretty much lasts forever. It's a mineral. You can't really have salt that loses saltiness. It doesn't happen. So what is Jesus talking about here? I don't think he's necessarily being literal and saying, hey, you know how salt loses its saltiness now. He's just saying, oh, what if? Because he doesn't say that it does. He says, but if salt has lost its taste, how can you get it back? He said, if it's lost its taste. And to me, that is more powerful, because to have him talk about something losing its taste, which really doesn't ever lose its taste, means that he's really focusing, to me, on the fact that this can be lost, that this characteristic that he's referring to, that he's illustrating, can be lost. And light can shine, and you can't really stop light from shining unless you cover it. And that's what he says here about light. You can stop salt by losing its saltiness. It really doesn't. But supposing it does, you can't stop light from shining, but you can cover it up and keep people from seeing it, is what he's saying. So in our case, he's really, really pushing the boundaries here to demonstrate to us that this is something that can be lost. You can lose your saltiness. You can lose your positive and direct impact on the people around you. You can do that. You can become tasteless to the people around you. You can become sour. You can become, like I said, tasteless, like you just don't matter. You don't really add anything to the lives of the people around you. And Jesus said, if you don't add anything, if you don't improve, if you're not helping out and giving people a positive experience, if you don't add something to the world and to the people around you directly, then you're not good for anything. Now, that's not to say that people are only as good as what you can get out of them. I think there are other places in the Bible where we see that that's clearly not, Jesus isn't saying that the measure of a person's worth is in what good they are to others. But he's saying as far as you are able, I believe is the point here. As far as you are able, then if you're not doing anything, but you could be, then what good are you? What good are you doing as salt? If you're not doing anything good for your neighbor across the street, then you're really of no benefit to them. You might as well not even exist. If your coworkers at work don't see you coming and feel pride and feel gratitude that you're working with them, don't feel grateful for you for something, even if it's just a warm smile and friendship and encouragement here and there, then you're not doing them any good. Again, we're not going to be able to be salt to everybody. That's the whole point of salt and light. Salt is very intimate. What you can do one-on-one, how you can affect somebody directly. So those people that you have a direct contact with ought to be benefited by your relationship with them. The second way is light, of course. And he says light can be lost too. You can cover light. You can take the light that you have and cover it up. And that would be a loss too to the world. Why in the world would you want to take your light that could be shining to everybody and just cover it up? Why would you want to take your testimony and your good works, as he says, and hide them? Now, a little bit later on in our lesson, if we were to get to it, I think point 2 or 3, I can't even remember which one now, Jesus talks about not doing good works to be seen. But I think there's a balance there. I really do. I think there's a balance because we don't do good works to be glorified ourselves, but we do want our good works to be seen and noticed as good works, because how else will the Father get glory if nobody sees that a good work has been done? You know what I mean? It means if you do something nice, for somebody, you say, well, the Lord laid you on my heart, or I felt like this is what Jesus would want me to do, or, anything like that. But we do have to let our light shine. Now, the other thing about salt and light is that they don't work independently. They are not means unto an end. We don't just get salt so that we can have salt, right? Nobody gets, maybe you do, maybe you are weird like this, but nobody goes out and buys a bunch of salt so that they can, eat it out of a cereal bowl with a spoon. Lord, I hope you don't do that. But no, we don't do that. We don't get salt and use it for the sake of salt. We don't just eat salt. We use salt to enhance the flavor of other foods. We put salt on a nice pork loin, or on a steak we're about to grill, or on some French fries. Or have you ever eaten grits or rice with no salt in it? It's pretty disgusting. It's almost like torture. So like you need salt to make grits worth eating. I know I'm in the South and we're supposed to love grits. And listen, I love grits, but if they ain't got salt in them, please don't insult me by serving me grits with no salt. So salt is used to enhance the flavor of something else. What about light? Okay. I gave you the analogy about shining the light in somebody's face. You don't get a light bulb just so you can stare at the light bulb. You know what I mean? We don't put lights in our kitchen so that we can walk right up to them and stare at the light bulb and be like, wow, this is so bright. I'm glad I've got light in my eyes. We put a light in the kitchen so that we can see the countertop. And when we're chopping onions, we don't chop our fingers off. We put a light in places that we want to see other things. We don't look at the light. We don't put a light up to look at the light. We put a light up so that we can see other things. So as you're salt, you're enhancing the flavors of life. You're making God's gifts to them better. And as you're light, you're illuminating God's good gifts to them and to you. Your good works are illuminating these things. We don't want people to look at us when we do good works. We want our good works to illuminate the glory of God, to cast light on what God is doing. So salt and light are all about how we affect people, both intimately and publicly. They're things that we can lose if we don't practice them. We've got to do them constantly. And there are also things that don't directly affect our relationship with those people. They are supposed to be enhancing something else. So we're to take our good works and enhance people's view of our faith of God. We're to take our good works and shine light on the glory of God and the goodness of God. Excuse me. Easier said than done, I know, but this is the point of the passage. In this passage, it is all about the usefulness of these two things, salt and light. It's all about their usefulness, not about them as a means to an end. So even here we can see that what our benefit to others and what our benefit to God is turning ourselves inside out, taking our thoughts and our gifts and everything that we have and pointing to Christ with those gifts, pointing others, taking somebody directly, one-on-one to Christ, taking people publicly and pointing them to Christ. Being salt and light is about affecting our community one-on-one and publicly, and not putting the spotlight on us, but putting it on God and Jesus. So this is what it's about to be a disciple of Jesus. Not just learning from him, but demonstrating to the world who he is. And that is point number 1. All right, I said at the beginning we might just stick with point number 1 as the lesson. I think we're going to do that today. We're going to close out today. We're going to let point number 1 stand as the lesson that Jesus' disciples are to be salt and light. And I pray that you would do that you would go and realize that you are salt and light in your community. But don't let your salt lose its saltiness, and don't cover your lamp with a bushel